Welcome to the Tamarack webinar with Michael McAfee, Vice President for Programs at PolicyLink and the Co-Director of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute. We've invited Michael to join us today for this conversation about his innovative neighborhood program, his journey to build a legacy grounded in equity, and how the Promise Neighborhoods Institute is using collective impact as a framework to build communities of opportunity. My name is Sylvia Chu. I'm the Director of Deepening Community at Tamarack, and I am delighted to be moderating this webinar with you this afternoon. To give you a bit of background, inspired by the successful model of the Harlem Children's Zone, the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink supports Promise Neighborhoods, communities of opportunity that are centered around strong schools to wrap children in education, health, and social supports from the cradle to college to career. By effectively coordinating the efforts of schools, families, social services, health centers, and community building programs, all children can fulfill their promise. Today, with the support of PNI, over 50 communities are planning or implementing results-focused, data-driven Promise Neighborhoods, scaling up to serve 200,000 children nationwide. I'd like to welcome Michael McAfee to our call today. As I said, Michael is the Vice President of Programs at PolicyLink and a Co-Director of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink. He has spent more than 20 years serving as a results-driven leader in the government, philanthropic, and human services sectors. Most recently, he has led cross-sector efforts to invest more than $700 million into the U.S.'s most distressed communities, building communities of opportunity from cradle to career. This has culminated in the Promise Neighborhoods program, which became a permanent federal program through the authorization of the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. As Vice President for Programs, Michael joins the executive and program teams in strategic planning, policy development, policy campaign strategy, and programmatic design and implementation at the local, state, and national levels. He's on a journey to build a legacy grounded in equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all are fully participating, prosperous, and reach their full potential. Michael, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
I'm hoping we can maybe start the webinar off by getting you to share a little bit about your own journey to this work. Tell us about what inspired you to start this movement.
Well, I have been inspired to start this movement from my own lived experience, coming out of poverty and then being fortunate to start my career very early on at a really progressive community foundation in Kansas City and learning the power of philanthropy married with the power of business and government and the nonprofit sector in terms of what they can do to transform a place, whether it be a neighborhood, a city, or a region. So in my entire career, I've been intrigued by this notion. How could I give back based on where I came from to improve communities? And as I've moved through my career from starting at the foundation to going to work for a nonprofit youth development intermediary, to ultimately getting to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where I had a $400 million portfolio to do community building work, I got to a place where I really realized that while we were giving out a lot of money as a federal agency, we were leaving a lot on the table in terms of the impact we could have. So when President Obama got in office and began to create the Promise Neighborhoods program, the Casey Foundation actually recommended that I go speak with the recruiter to get this opportunity. And that's why I left the comfort of, my secure federal job and all of that, because I knew that in terms of my interest, in terms of my passion, in terms of what I knew my soul wanted to do, in terms of the work, that this was one of those maybe once in your career opportunities. And so I left Chicago, moved to Oakland, California, and became the first director of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute. So that's the journey that led me here. This deep sense that this is my vocation. It's not a job. This is the work that I would be doing. Or I tell many folks I'd rather be homeless if I couldn't do this work. I don't want to work in any other capacity. And so that's how I got here.
Wow. Very, very powerful. It reminds me one of the big social innovators in Canada, a fellow by the name of Alec Mansky, talks about any lasting social change movement always including someone who he would call the passionate amateur, who is motivated by love. And
Yes.
as I listen to your story and your deep, deep connection to your own lived experience, and the way you frame this as a vocation and your willingness to forego safety and make a courageous leap to make an even bigger impact, boy, that notion of the passion that drives someone motivated by love really comes through loud and clear. So the Harlem Children's Zone was really the first initiative, was it not? That was sort of the pilot for many of what has now become the Promise Neighborhoods program and initiative. Is that correct?
That's correct. What's important about what's going on in the United States is this, that the culmination of us getting to Promise Neighborhoods has really been 40-plus years in the making, with us learning how to do place-based work, community building work, housing, neighborhood revitalization, etc. And it was Jeff Canada who took all of that legacy of work, probably from the 1960s forward, and was able to put it into a package that started creating this seamless system of supports for children in Harlem, in the most vulnerable neighborhood, and to put that system of supports together from cradle to career. So he was able to do it with rigor that was different than what people had seen before. He was able to do it at a scale that was not seen before. He was able to start creating a culture of accountability of the staff that had not been seen before. And he was able to start building an organization in terms of the revenue he was generating every year, plus the endowment to sustain the work that has not been seen before or even seen now, quite frankly. And so that became the benchmark for what Senator Obama at that time saw and wanted to use as the model for the national program. And what's also important is that while Harlem Children's Zone is the hallmark of what we hope can happen in community, we're very clear that what happened in Harlem is unique. There's a lot of variables that went into how they got there, but it doesn't mean that we can't implement the operating principles across the country. So we're not trying to say, do what Harlem did. What we're trying to say to folks is, there are a couple of operating principles that we should all consider as best practice as we think about creating communities of opportunity from cradle to career. And those operating principles are things like serve an entire neighborhood comprehensively and at scale, create a comprehensive pipeline of effective programs for children from birth through college and graduation, and wrap that pipeline in supports for families, build community among residents, institutions, and stakeholders who help to create the environment necessary for a child's healthy development, evaluate program outcomes to create a data feedback loop to help management improve and refine program offerings, and ultimately cultivate a culture of success rooted in passion, accountability, leadership, and teamwork. So it is those operating principles that we work with other communities to figure out how do they operationalize them within their own community context.
Wow, I really appreciate that nuance around it's not about replicating a program. It is, as you, and you've so clearly distilled out what those common operating principles are that, that will help ensure that whatever the unique context of any community would be, that if you abide by those principles, you're probably quite likely to get to an initiative that looks very much like the success or the hallmark of the Harlem Children's Zone. So
Right.
That nuance I think is really important. And I heard in there, and also in your own story, the essential recognition of different sectors coming together, and
Yes.
quite unusual partners coming together with residents sort of as one of those key players. Can you say a little bit more about that and also some of the challenges around bringing different sectors together?
This is an important value for us, in that if you're going to build communities of opportunities, we believe that there's a couple of things that you got to do, and that it starts with you got to empower community. This is not about professionalizing community building. It is about joining our professional expertise with that voice, wisdom, and experience that comes from community to do this work. And so we enter in community with that humility and recognize that, communities will move when they want to. They don't care about grant cycles. They don't care about your new shiny initiative. You can do all that at your own peril, but communities are dying for and needing us to join them with our expertise and our ability to bring what the science says works, etc., and to join that with their energy, with the things that they care about. And so what that might often look like is we may want to start with, say, early learning or third grade reading as an example, and discover that before we can get to third grade reading, we've actually got to deal with housing, because that's the pressure that is on our community. So for us, it is starting with what's the pain in the community that we must deal with, and then we can back into our thing. And what we discover is that when we don't go into community building that way, it really creates a very toxic environment where our hopes and fantasies about what we could have accomplished are soon dashed. So we start with that. We hold community to the same standard as everyone else. We believe it's not about just calling a meeting of 100 folks and just getting them in a room and saying, what do you want? It is about this collaboration getting clear about what are the results that we are putting at the center of our work. And then what is the contribution that everyone must play? Because, see, until you can tell me what your contribution is, there's no value that you're bringing. And when you don't have value, you act out. So for us, whether you are a community resident or anyone else, we say the price of admission to any of our meetings where we're doing this work is to own a contribution. Because if you can't tell us the results, if you can't tell us that indicator or measure of progress that you're working on, and if you can't tell us your specific contribution, it says a couple of things. It says, one, our container is not the right container. We haven't set it right for transformative work to happen. Two, it says that we're undisciplined and being very sloppy. And three, it says we have just probably increased the probability that we're going to fail because we haven't aligned the beautiful contributions of all the partners. We simply call the meeting, and we projected into our undisciplined way of coming together our fantasies about what we hope to happen. But we haven't brought our operational expertise to the table to actually make it happen. So for us, community is essential to doing this work. It is not about pacifying community. It is not about placating them. It is about saying, these are your children. You do need to own something that's going on in your house to make their lives better. And as your nonprofit colleague or your government colleague or your business colleague, I too have a contribution to play in that. Now let's put them all together and get them aligned right. What we say is we want to get everybody in high action and high alignment so that we can do this work at a scale that we rarely achieve.
So do you find when you go in, as you're often not coming in to a blank slate, right? You're coming into a community that has, perhaps had a lot of undisciplined efforts. So if you're seeing sort of the seeds of, the right stuff happening, but not the right kind of rigor or discipline, is it possible to kind of sharpen that focus and bring it back on track, or
Yes.
or do you have to go through a recontracting process with the key players? Like, what does that look like?
So for us, I believe this is the work of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute, and I think it is the work of intermediaries that we have to call out bad practice. You just got to call it out, and it doesn't matter what's preceded, you got to call it out. And you got to so the first step is to develop the muscle to start setting this stuff up right for success. But even when you do that, there's still mess that we got to go through. But if it's not structured right, you got to clean it up. And we start by cleaning it up by being clear about what are the results and the indicators that we're trying to achieve. Because until we have that, we often end up churning because our work isn't grounded. So yes, we believe that we always say if we're going to add value as an intermediary, our voice must be disruptive but respectful. And by disruptive, what I mean is we've got to disrupt those old patterns of behavior that get in the way of being effective. So that's what we do. We will call it out, and we will begin to fix it together. So we're not going to fly in and call something out and then walk off and leave you hanging.
Right, right. You're there, you're going to call it out, but you're going to call it out in the spirit of supporting what needs to grow
That's,
as an alternative.
that's,
So when you talk
that's
about
right.
the fact that, you know, the work of community unfolds at its own pace, right? And at its own readiness and based on its own aspirations, not, you know, what's the aspiration of a particular program or initiative or organization or even a funder. How do you hold that tension creatively, you know, where, you know, the organizations are coming to the table, but they have mandates and missions that they're accountable for around, you know, the implementation of particular programs, or, you know, you've got a grant funder who has said, we need you to accomplish X by, you know, within 24 months or within 5 years. How do you hold that tension so that it is in fact honoring of the authentic development of a community?
So the first thing is pushing back on folks who set arbitrary deadlines, because that is bad practice. So I tell funders all the time, you know, you've got to practice what you preach. If you're going to start setting artificial deadlines and performance measures and you don't understand the way things work on the ground, that's bad practice, and they need to be called out on it. You know, where does a 24-month deadline come from? You know, I mean, it's great to say when you have power and money, but you're disconnected from reality, and that's not fair to nonprofits. It's not fair to community. So on one hand, you can't tell me to honor community, and then you tell me, well, you know what? I came up with this deadline just sitting in my office because this is what our board thought was good.
Right.
You know, that is an example. That is an example of ways in which we oppress communities, and then we start slapping our name, our cultural terminology over it, like a 24-month community building process. That's bullshit. You know, quite frankly, you know, that's not acceptable, and we've got to stop doing that. If you really want to set good strategy, if you really want to know how to build community, you get on the ground, and what you may discover is that, you know what, it may take us a year to get through some of our mess or some of the damage that has been done from bad practice before, and then we can really accelerate and start holding each other accountable. But see, to me, until you can tell me your results, until you can tell me your indicator, and until you can tell me what people have agreed to contribute, I can't tell you what we can accomplish.
Right on.
And so that's an example of me getting that container tight. To have a conversation around deadlines and what we're going to achieve, and nobody in that room has agreed to do anything, or their institutions haven't agreed to do anything, that's fantasy. And we start getting, you know, we start getting driven by a program officer's board of a foundation's agenda when there's no alignment on the ground. And so our job at the Institute is to say, let's stop this bad practice. If we set it up right, we can accelerate. But if I don't set it up right, I've got to be willing to deal with the mess that I know is coming. And it's going to come from nonprofits not being accountable. It's going to come from community members not being accountable. It's going to come from the press who starts hearing about the messy work that we're doing. And it's going to come from others on different sides of that political spectrum who will use our flailing around as a political opportunity to crush this work. So there are huge implications for our bad practice. And so we think that the opportunity for the field right now is to master what you hear me describing, which is this ability to operate at another level, operational excellence in service of getting results at scale. And until we bring that discipline, until we bring this greater level of leadership that is not just focused on just go do something, but is focused on setting the game up right, we're going to constantly have a tension that we can't resolve. And you can't resolve this by writing a paper about it. You resolve it by leading on it. The last thing I'll say on this is this. I equate it to a good coach on a sports team. You can have a whole lot of talented players, but if you can't get those players to work in a system together, it rarely works. Sometimes you win some games. Generally, you don't win the championship. And that's what happens with us. Sometimes you got some leaders who, just by sheer force of will, they can get some good stuff done. But as soon as they leave, everything falls back apart. That's not a championship way of building community. The championship way of building community is to start lining everybody's contributions up, building that bench up so that regardless of the political season, regardless of the season around funding, etc., we can continue to move the work. And that's what we're trying to build with Promise Neighborhoods, is a way of going about getting results that will be enduring, regardless of political season, regardless of the funding cycle and regardless of the ebbs and flows of how community gets energy and moves it on the ground.
I think what I particularly loved about your response, many things, you heard me giggling in the background, struck a chord with me, but I think, you know, from the earlier response where you were talking about the role of intermediaries around having the discipline to call out bad practice, you modeled it so beautifully in terms of how you would engage a funder, right, or a service provider around a particular program. So I think that's really useful to not only hear about it, but to see you model it so beautifully in action. So let me ask you, how are your promise neighborhoods selected? Like, do you folks have like a minimum benchmark around readiness? Do you have some specific criteria that you would be looking for before you would sort of say, okay, this is a neighborhood that we think is ready to work with us and do the work?
So here's the exciting thing about the way we work. The Promise Neighborhoods Institute has absolutely no control, no power over who gets selected. The United States government does. The U.S. Department of Education sends out a funding notice. And that funding notice says, I want you to apply for a planning grant and you can get $500,000, or I want you to apply for an implementation grant. You can get up to $30 million over 5 years. And they have some criteria. It's the typical stuff that you see in applications around needs assessments, how you'll measure progress, how you will use data for learning continuous improvement, and how you will put your management team together. It's all the typical blah, blah, blah stuff. And so what people usually end up writing is fiction, right? Because we don't know how to do this work. And so what we've been working with the Department of Education around, and they've been great partners in this, is this. In this day and age, when you're trying to do adaptive work, for which we don't know the answers, to ask people to tell you what they're going to do today is folly, and then to hold them to it. Because what you just said is, I'm taking away your ability to learn, I'm taking away your ability to create emergent strategy, and I'm putting your feet in cement. And what you said you were going to do on June 1st, 2016 is what I'm holding you to on June 1st, 2018. And then, oh, by the way, then I'm going to come back and ask you to tell me, what did you learn? It's craziness, right? And so our role in that is to say, you know, that's the structure of the environment. Let's take what we're getting. Let's not complain. Let's complain about it. Let's work to fix it. But we'll take what we can get. So when those grantees get their money, this is where we believe our job kicks in, and we start using some of the tools we've created, like the Developmental Pathway, et cetera. And we start working with sites to say things like, what a missed opportunity to get $30 million to serve 200 kids and have done no policy and systems work. That's a travesty, right? And it's not like nonprofit leaders don't want to do that. The reality is, you know, you get in a way of operating based on how your capital is structured. So it's not surprising that a lot of our nonprofit leaders are, you know, they're writing proposals and trying to do the best they can to meet the terms of what it's required to get the money. And so often what's required to get the money is not what's required to get the work done. And so our job is to say, okay, we're your partner. You got the grant. Now let's help you figure out, how do you take an opportunity where you basically wrote a grant to get a program, to use this as the wedge into working with partners across sectors to create the right mix of solutions that includes families owning something, high-quality programs, policies, and systems change. And how do we help you think about scaling that work beyond a few hundred or a few thousand kids to meeting that demand in that community, because that is the work of our time. We've been doing good programs. We've been doing initiatives. Nothing new there. And there's nothing wrong with doing those. But that's why I said the right mix of solutions, because it's not an either or. But the work for this time is for us to build systems of supports, pathways into the middle class at a scale that is commensurate with the population level numbers that we keep looking at and complaining about. It's no sense to look at population level numbers and write a needs assessment that says there are 20,000 kids living in this community that are below poverty, and then you design a program for 200 of them. That's beneath our ability to act, you know, and that's what we do every day. Stop looking at the population level numbers and writing a good needs assessment. And then how you organize is so beneath what the data told you needed to do. So that is our work, and that's how then we join with our partners to start saying, let's take this step together, and we're going to figure out how to do this and build something that will last beyond that 5-year grant.
Oh, this is beautiful. Now, a couple of times you've mentioned the developmental pathways approach that you have for achieving Promise Neighborhood results. Can you unpack that a bit more for us and tell us a bit more about what that looks like?
Sure. This came out of my own reflection on my own bad practice. So, I was going out and I'm talking to people about results at scale, and I'm talking to people about collective impact and all these concepts. And the bad practices is this. We don't have a mental map for how to do this work, so we all shake our heads and say, yeah, that sounds really good. Okay, I'm going to go get collective impact, and I'm going to go do results-based accountability. And then you go back 2 weeks later, and folks are still doing the same thing. And then, and I was getting frustrated, like, why aren't we having progress? Well, we weren't having progress because of what I said about adaptive work. So just as the nonprofits have their challenges around, if I'm doing adaptive work, what does it look like from a practice standpoint? As intermediaries providing coaching and technical assistance, we've got to ask ourselves the same question. From a technical assistance standpoint, what is the new mental map that I got to help people see and create to replace the old way of doing business? I just can't say, hey, don't focus on programs, put the right mix of solutions together. Everybody would say, hey, man, hallelujah, that sounds really wonderful, but then.
And now can you tell us what they are?
Yes, and I had no tool for these people to do it. So the developmental pathway was our way of saying, let's break down what we mean by all these fancy words we're using. Let's make sure it's grounded in what we know is just the core business of what does it take to do this work. And then let's start coaching to it so that every partner, U.S. Department of Education, the White House, the Harlem Children's Zone, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, Policy Link, and the sites, we're all coaching from the same script. And if folks don't want to do this, then they can't be technical assistance providers. So for us, it was about us getting our parallel system in alignment with what was happening locally. See, so often we tell the nonprofit leaders, you guys do all this tough work. We're just going to sit back and tell you what to do. No, it meant that we needed to get in alignment as national partners trying to support these local leaders. And this was our work to get in high action, high alignment, which was to say, we are talking, we have a point of view, we're manifesting it every time we interact with you. Unfair that we're not unpacking it so you really know what it means and what it looks like. And we need to slow down and do that. And when I chose to say, you know what, Michael, it's not that the problem is with the sites not getting it. That may be a piece of it, but there's a bigger contribution here in that you just haven't figured out how to help them have a breakthrough. So when I got angry one weekend and just sat down and said, you know what, I'm going to slow down and I'm going to figure this out and put this together, it was a great breakthrough for me in that I needed to do my work. And there was something different about my work, which was, can't just be smart and show up. I got to do the tough work of really slowing down, figuring out what all these words mean, unpacking them, and then beginning to create a culture where everybody's buying into this is the way we're going to operate. And that's what we've created in the Promise Neighborhoods ecosystem, is that this is the way we operate no matter whether you're on the ground as a grantee, whether you're a partner of a grantee, or you're one of the national organizations that are supporting this work. And then we had to have the fights that are necessary to get in alignment. It just doesn't happen because you put the pretty graphic together. We really had to have some tough conversations with each other about how we needed to get out of each other's way, how we needed to trust each other to play our roles out, etc. And we got there.
That's remarkable because, you know, when it's your job and it's your livelihood, you know, it brings another level of emotionality and investment into the dialogues, which, you know, when you're being the technical support person and it's not you, you don't necessarily feel with the same pressure on a day-to-day basis. Can I ask?
There's one thing about that is very important.
Okay.
The only reason I got there was because was for success. If we didn't choose at P&I, the Promise Neighborhoods Institute, to own the same results 10 results and 15 indicators as our colleagues on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
there would have been no real reason to try to figure this out because I wouldn't have been under the same pressure or feeling the same pain. But when we said, you know what, as an intermediary, we're going to do something different. We're going to only measure our success by our sites making progress, moving from the baseline on one of those 15 indicators, one of those 15 measures of progress. We're not going to measure ourselves by how many PowerPoints we do, how many tools we create, how many conferences we hold, how much time we run around talking to folks. The one standard is, are they making progress on those 10 results and 15 indicators? And when we made that simple commitment, we joined the same pain point as everyone else. Yeah. So when you hear me talking about contribution, it's not random contribution. Everybody's got to own a contribution to the same results and the same indicators. And then you find your role from where you sit. And when you do that, it's easier to get in alignment because I didn't have a choice. I didn't have the luxury of going off and just telling a story about, well, you know, those nonprofits just don't have capacity, and let me write up a case study about why they suck. I couldn't do that because I was their colleague. I'm in this with them. So if they're not successful, I'm not. And that is how you get into high action and high alignment and achieve collective impact. It's not like you give somebody some money and walk away and then say, well, they failed. No, you failed with them. Are you succeeding with them? So that's how we got here. By making that simple decision on the front end forced me to feel enough pain that I had to do something different. I couldn't rely on those typical fallbacks that intermediary organizations will use. I'm just going to write a paper about what I'm seeing. No, I got to figure out something practical to move the work.
What you've given is so much wisdom here. You know, it reminds me, my colleague Liz Weaver will often say, you know, simplicity you can find on the other side of complexity. And what you've said so beautifully is, you know what, it gets really simple when I hold myself accountable to the very same outcomes and impacts holding my community partners accountable to. Then I have the same level of stake in the game, and I'm equally committed. So can you just one or two quick questions more before we open up the line. I see some questions already starting to bubble, which is fabulous. You've talked a little bit about those, you know, how you set and evaluate results and you establish indicators. Is there a fairly constant set that shows up from initiative to initiative, or are they quite varied? And if so, how did they get determined?
Okay, so when we gave this work to the White House, we looked at what the literature said and married it with our professional experience to come up with what are those, on that cradle to career continuum, what are the best developmental markers for a child's success? So there are things like children having a medical home, access to a primary care physician, they have access to good high-quality early childhood or early childhood development opportunities. They're entering school ready to learn. They're proficient in core academic subjects. They're reading at 3rd grade. They are matriculating to high school. They're going to college without needing remedial courses. Their neighborhood is safe. They're healthy. They're eating fresh fruits and vegetables. They're exercising at least 60 minutes a day, etc. So none of those things are really unique to Promise Neighborhood. Those are things that we know if you lined up that continuum and didn't put a name on it, you would say, yeah, those things are pretty good. So for us, we use the wisdom of the science and the wisdom of our common sense to say that makes sense. And then we didn't spend a lot of time saying, let's argue about it. We always want to argue about what the results and indicators are. Pick one and get going on it. There's nothing there that if you're going to do cradle to career work, you need to do it all. So that's the thing for us, is to not get bogged down on haggling whether we start with 3rd grade reading or children have a medical home. What we need you to do is to develop the muscle to be able to work in this new way. And if you can do it for 3rd grade reading, then you can replicate it for children being proficient in core academic subjects. So for us, that's what was important, is to say, there's enough literature out there that tells us that every developmental stage is what works. What we want you to do is to get going on something and master it, learn from what will make it work in your context locally, and then keep building on it. And so that's what we've done. So what's written into the federal notice is 10 results and 15 indicators, and communities can add a couple more of their own if they like. So every community, every site will be working on at least those 10 and 15, and they'll add their own nuances. And they'll be doing it very differently, of course, because, you know, like in Berea, Kentucky, which is rural Appalachia, You know, the way they don't have the rich nonprofit ecosystem that you have in urban environments. So their work looks very different. They use a lot of the university extension campuses, the Lions and the Kiwanis Cubs, et cetera, to help them do their work and provide that infrastructure. You'll see them having to spend more of their money on transportation costs because the child may have to go 20 miles to an after-school program after they leave school. And they know families can't afford that fuel cost, so they'll pay for that. So their strategies look very different than what you might see in some urban areas. And so while they're still working on the 10 and 15, they have the flexibility to craft the right strategy to accomplish it on their own.
Oh, that's beautiful. Because what you're highlighting is sometimes it's you know, how we do the work that matters as much as whatever the indicator is that we choose to focus on at any one point in time.
Yeah, that's the innovation right now.
Yeah. So let me ask you, before we open up the line to questions, because that's where I want to go next, while we're waiting for folks to populate a few additional questions that may be bubbling, can you maybe wrap up sort of this dialogue piece of our call by sharing a real sort of inspiration or success story that is sort of what inspires you, particularly when the times get tough, because this work can be tough.
It does get tough, and we're in one of those cycles where you know, you go through the funding cycles where you're well funded, and then you have those moments where foundations are figuring out what next, and you just gotta wait. So we're, as an institute, we're in kind of one of those moments. And at times I get frustrated because I'm like, man, this is the very moment where our sites are really rolling, and now I gotta wait a little bit and figure out how to keep this thing going. You know, and while everybody's trying to figure out what they're going to do, when the reality is you're going to come right back to this work because this is it. So I'm holding that anger, quite frankly. I'm holding that frustration, and I'm trying to figure out how to go forward. And what I'm still seeing is, as our first two cohorts of sites come off of their grant cycles of $30 million, they have transformed, like in Minneapolis, the way the nonprofit sector is working together around the 10 and 15 in terms of the results. They started getting money from their state legislature by passing Cradle to Career legislation. They've gotten Target and General Mills to pitch in $6 million to start helping them move that work beyond the grant period. You're seeing folks braid this into the fabric of their community in a way that is truly what we thought we wanted to happen. It was what we were saying. This can't just be a program that ends in 5 years. That this is a way of operating that will transform community if we stick to it. And by the mere fact that we're saying Cradle to Career would suggest a 20-year journey. We're only 5 years in, and we're seeing that happen now. So to be able to go to Minneapolis and see the state legislators adopting this, to see California getting ready to put legislation on the ballot to create 40 promised neighborhoods that has nothing to do with the federal effort, to have a quality standard that we've created as a network that says, this is what good promised neighborhoods practice looks like, that they've all agreed to, is huge. And then ultimately to start seeing things happen in terms of real results in terms of children's lives, like the summer slide in Minneapolis has gone down. So they've reversed it. So, you know, usually in the summer, children will lose proficiency in reading and math because they're not in academically enriched environments. They've changed that. The mobility rate in Buffalo has gone down. The mobility rate is where children are not staying in one school during an academic year. They're bouncing all over the place. They've been able to take that from like 30% to 18%. We're seeing attendance rates go through the roof because places like San Antonio have put in early warning systems to start reaching out to those families to figure out what stresses have you not bringing your children to school. We're seeing parents now starting to talk about what we're learning about toxic stress and how it impacts a child's physiology and how to create healthy learning spaces in their homes, and they're doing it. In what we're talking about, public housing developments are just regular, you know, low to moderate income families living in a regular old home and figuring out how to do this. We're seeing academic performance index scores of how you measure schools go up by 23 points in Los Angeles. We're seeing folks start getting in just 5 years to serving, you know, from a few hundred to starting to get into the thousands of children that they're serving. And this is with setbacks. This is with us still not having it all right yet. This is with, you know, good staff coming and going. That's what we're seeing.
And I love it because it's not one story, right? They're little seeds
Right.
and examples that this thing is turning into a movement, and that you don't necessarily have to be the ones driving it, that the communities authentically are owning it. And they're making it mean what it needs to mean for them and moving it ahead. This is fantastic. Well, Michael, you have totally inspired all of us, and I can see already we got some questions bubbling in. So maybe I can lead off. The first, from Elizabeth Kelly, she said, how is the research process and outside research, and how are outside research sources included within your work at the neighborhood setting?
So perfect, great question. We think that the research is important for a couple of reasons. We think research is really important for us right now phenomenologically because we need to recalibrate expectations. This work does not happen in 50 and 60% increases in 3 months, 6 months, or a year. It happens in those 5, 7, 8 consistent marches. So what we've done at the national level to provide our site some air cover is we hired mathematical policy research to do 5 case studies that really tried to help us understand what does it take to do cradle-to-career work, because we don't know what it takes. This is new for the field. There's not a lot of literature around it. So we wanted to start building the evidence around. Let's give people expectations right. When you heard me talk about program officers, if we want to help them, can't just critique them. We need to have some evidence that says, did you know that when we look across our sites that, the average increase for reading proficiency is a good, 5 to 6 percentage points a year, and that if you do that over a couple of years, you really didn't have a big number, but it's not happening in these, things people sell in their grant reports. Like, I got a 30% increase. It's not happening that way. So we're doing that at the national level, creating that evaluation framework to provide our sites air cover and to build evidence for the field. At the same time, our local leaders are doing that evaluation as well. Process, formative, summative. They're doing their own evaluation because they need to be able to tell their own result story moving from the baseline. And then we facilitate that by our data management system, which is we use a data dashboard. So when they come to convenings, et cetera, they're constantly bringing their data dashboard with the story already told in it about how they're moving from the baseline, what challenges they're still experiencing, and how they need our help to move the ball. When I say our help, it could be from the Promise Neighborhoods Institute, or it could be from some of their colleagues in another location.
Right.
That's how we do evaluation.
So a second question, somewhat related, from Pam Swick-Janjak, I think. If community is deciding and determining that they need to impact, what they need to do to impact their neighborhood, how is it that the federal government is determining where the funding goes? Like, how do you connect the dots, I guess?
So this is the complexity in our work. I mean, I don't know of a parent who would say, I don't want my kid to be healthy, I don't want my child to enter school ready to learn, etc. So I don't see a problem with the federal government saying this is what the science says, this is what we know works to start building out that cradle-to-career continuum. Now the problem comes if you go into the community and you then just want to start ramming down their throats. I want you to start getting your kids ready to learn, and you're not willing to listen to. Well, in order for me to do that, do you know, here's what my challenge is. I actually can't take time off work to do X, or I need help doing this. So part of it is saying, let's take the hand we've been dealt and still join community authentically. Because if I sit down with a family and say, do you want your kid to be healthy? Yes. Do you want them to have a primary care physician? Yes. Now help me understand why they don't. And if I can relieve that pain, I'm now into my results framework. The problem is, so many of us show up to community acting like that's the problem. That's not the problem. These families want the same things we all want for our kids. We just don't listen to the stresses that they have to get there. And what we found is when we slow down, yes, we know we got an agenda, but it's not incompatible with theirs if we listen. And if we can figure out how to remove those pain points, then we're successful. And that's where we spend a lot of time, which is to say, if you look at our sites and say, where did they start? Many of them started in very different places. Some said, hey, you know what, there's energy in the community. We've been doing good work around early learning. We're going to start there. Others said, you know what, we got to go all the way to high school graduation and work backwards because that's where our energy is at. And that is totally okay. You know, when we started dealing with student mobility as an example, that is one where the mobility is an indicator. And what the community said is, you know what, don't talk to me about mobility until you help me find housing, because that's the problem. The reason I'm bouncing around is not because I want to bounce around, it's because I'm housing insecure. So the city of Buffalo used some of their federal dollars from another federal program to rehab houses on a couple of blocks that had been devastated in 2008 by the financial crisis, so they had been foreclosed. They rehabbed those houses. They prioritized families living in the promised neighborhood zones, and they dealt with the housing insecurity. And by dealing with that, they dealt with the mobility rate. You see, so that was a perfect example. They didn't need you to go do outreach and lecture them on mobility. They needed you to simply listen to understand what was driving their problem with mobility.
And get creative around solution.
And get creative around solutions, and that's what they did. They took care of the housing problem, solved the mobility problem. We don't have a housing indicator. And so that's an example right there. You know, so that's an example right there that if you don't pay attention to what is the story that is driving the trend line for that indicator, you would have missed it and would have just said, you know what, I'm going to create a workshop where I tell parents the importance of, you know, their kids staying in school. It may have been great information. It wouldn't have been the right solution. So that's how we do it. You start listening to families and say, you know what, how do we accomplish this together? They'll start telling you what needs to happen. And that's when they'll listen to you even more. Right. And so we're able to bring our professional expertise with their wisdom of what's going on in their lives and marry it together and come up with a solution that works for everybody. We got our mobility rate solved. They got their housing problem solved. Now we collectively together have a powerful result story to tell in Buffalo about the mobility rate.
And then they tackle the next thing, right? Beautiful.
That's right. That's right.
So there's two other questions here that I want to make sure we have time for before we have to wrap up. The first is from Craig Carpenter. He said, how do you connect with communities and overcome their understandable skepticism when so often they see new faces arrive with projects and ideas and then they disappear?
First is I would say that most people have to get away from, you know, thinking they need to read books to learn how to talk to people who have just a little less resource than them. Part of the disconnect starts with how we show up individually. We show up as scared of community people that we don't know and haven't worked with and don't have relationships with. We act like they are lab rats to be examined and dealt with. We don't join them the way we join our other colleagues in the world. And so part of the problem is we're showing up in a way that it's just, it wouldn't even work for us. When we go to a store and someone seems like they're uncomfortable around us, or they're suspect, we don't even open up. So why would we expect these folks to do that? My annoyance is that we think connecting with community has become this exotic academic exercise. I got to read a book to know how to talk to black people. I got to go to a workshop. You may need to, we all may need to deal with our blind spots regardless of your race, absolutely. But when you join authentically and you're saying to folks, hey, you know what, I'm here to listen, and I'm not here to do this for you either. I'm here to do it with you. You see something radically different happen when you just say to folks, you know what, the reality is we may be here for 5 years or 10 years. You're going to be here for however long you choose to be. So let's do this together. So part of this is to recalibrate the expectation to say, I'm not your savior. I'm your partner in this work. And I may go and find another job, but while I'm here, here's my contribution. So when you can get clear about a contribution, it gives you the way to anchor your work. My contribution may be for a year, and I may be gone. You may be there for the next 20 years. And so that is why it is essential that community members own this, because the way I'm talking, community members need to be talking. That's the capacity that has to be built. And when you enter that way, folks understand the way the world works. People come and go. Things change. They get that. But what they don't get is when people come in inauthentically, they sell a bill of goods, they all get paid really well to sell a lie, and then they're all gone, and the community got nothing for it. So when we start saying to folks, you know what, when you come to meetings, I'm going to pay you for your time to come to meetings, just like I pay all these nonprofits. I'm going to pay you to work. You're going to share in the resource, just like everybody else does. See, when you can hold that value to say, I'm not going to just pimp you out and have you come to meetings for free and feed you. I'm going to let you share in the resource to build this community. Watch how that changes. I would be offended, too, if everybody came to my community, everybody got paid, and I didn't get anything. And that's how we show up inauthentically, and then we're surprised that people are skeptical. Change that behavior. Treat them as full partners and watch what happens.
More of look at the presenting issue and go deeper and understand what's underneath it.
Yeah, and then share power and resource authentically. And when you really do that and people really see you doing that, you see people's guard go down. I always tell people, you should never trust me. You should never trust me. You should get trusted over time by my ability to deliver. And if I don't deliver, you should hold me accountable. You should run me out of your community. So I don't go into community asking people to trust. I ask for us to create a culture of accountability where we will all see who's performing and who's not, because quite frankly, sometimes community members need to be called out for not performing, and we need to call that out too. So that culture of accountability gives you the ability to create that space to be able to deal with everybody's lack of accountability, no matter where it shows up.
Beautiful. Last question from John Boyer. The underlying principles that are guiding your work are rich. I'm working in a climate where the learning styles of those directing the agenda are stretched to see through the lens that is being suggested. Are there training resources that I can access to help bring this way of viewing into the context that I am working in?
I'm not sure I understand the question. If I'm hearing it correctly, is it that you're trying to introduce a framework and folks just aren't getting that frame, and you're asking, are there resources to help people get the framework that you're trying to advance? I'll wait a moment and see if you can type and help us understand that.
I'm just seeing if
okay.
This comes in. John, if you're there, maybe you can add a bit more to clarify.
Hi there, Sylvia. It's Christy. John says yes.
So what I often say to people is, it's part of our problem is that we keep introducing too many frameworks. It's not a problem that people have different learning styles and things, because we all show up very differently. We all have different blind spots, et cetera, and we can deal with that and hold that level of complexity. What I often find is that when a framework is being introduced and there's resistance, it usually means that we haven't gone deep enough to really unpack what's going on in our system. When I get resistance around frameworks, it's usually, I'll give you a good example. There's been a lot of resistance around collective impact. And so people thought that collective impact resistance was around the frame, but it was not. It was around two big things that were originally missed. Folks who have been doing community work for many years, especially community people of color, felt like, you know what? We've been doing this work calling it community building. Some consultants came along, repackaged it, called it collective impact, never acknowledged the previous work that had gone on to create that frame. And now they're out selling it like it's brand new, and for us it's not, and so we feel left behind. That was the unspoken thing behind it. So that you start seeing people roll their eyes about collective impact or go talk in the parking lot about it. It wasn't a resistance to the frame, it was the lack of honoring how the shoulders that frame stood on. Another part of the resistance to that frame was that most of the tables who got developed around collective impact in communities were elite and white. So you're talking about community building, but the collective impact tables are not the people, the nonprofit leaders, the community members, et cetera. And so that created the resistance. So it may be to start. So we got to dig deeper around where is that resistance coming from? So I often try to ask questions like, and I can send you a tool that we use called a critical incident app to ask, so we start asking our system, why is our system not taking this up? And let's get honest about why is that happening. And I'm sharing that example around collective impact because folks could have went to a training, they could have had someone come in and be inspirational, and all of that would have been work avoidance. Because what finally needed to be said, and FSG, to their amazement and applaud, they did this. They came back and wrote an article that says, hey, you know what, we missed it. We didn't put equity front and center in the collective impact frame. We missed it. We're sorry. We've learned from it, and we've done it. That's what people needed. They didn't need a lecture. They didn't need a rah-rah speech. They needed the leadership to acknowledge, you know what, we're human. We missed something. We're going to fix it, and they did. Now people can take up that frame and join. And so I'm sharing that because sometimes we think that if I get a little bit more assistance, a little bit more training, I'll get it. And sometimes that's needed, and sometimes it's simply work avoidance because we're afraid to go deep and be honest about what the real barrier or the resistance to the frame is. So explore that more so that you can really tease out, is this really a training problem? Or is this really a problem that we keep convening a meeting where folks just won't shoot straight with each other about the issue because they don't trust?
Beautiful,
and
Michael.
That's why I shared that one around the collective impact, because it was not an issue around training or anything. It was an issue around people feeling aggrieved and not trusting because of what they saw happening.
I would love it too. If you can share with us the critical incident map tool that you talked about, we'll make sure that we include that when we send out the recording for everyone of this call.
Will do.
So I can't believe it, but we're already at 1 o'clock. So I do want to thank you, Michael. I could certainly have kept this conversation going for quite some time. But I do appreciate your time and that you've shared so deeply of the insights that you have in doing this work. Many thanks to all of you who've joined our call this afternoon, and your comments and questions have certainly helped to make this dynamic and thought-provoking. Also want to just acknowledge our supporters, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, the Maytree Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and Province of Ontario for helping to make all these calls possible. And as promised, we will be sending an email to you in the next few days that has links to this audio and other related materials from today's call, and we welcome your feedback around that. You'll see on your screen there, inviting you to come and join our learning community, Deepening Community, www.deepeningcommunity.ca for more resources that are focused specifically on neighborhoods, and are so excited and want to invite all of you to come and join us in Edmonton along with John McKnight, Vicki Kamak, Alec Mansky, Paul Bourne, Deepening Community, Resilient Neighborhoods, When People Care, June 7th to 9th. We'd love to see you there. So thanks, everyone. Have a fabulous afternoon. And we will also be sending out to you our information about our next 2 Spring Learning Series talks. Hope to see you joining us there as well. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks again, Michael, for a fabulous conversation.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.